everyone! So today's video is going to be the final module recap for the horticulture class that I am taking this semester. Now, just as a refresh, I am taking classes through the University of Illinois, all online, in order to get my horticulture certification. So there are 4 classes that I have to take total based on the credit hours that they're each worth. And this is my second class. I've been taking a class a semester, so I have 2 more classes to take before I have my certification. And the one that I'm taking this semester is called, I never remember the name, but it's Planting, Biodiversity, and Aesthetics. And just in case you are looking it up for the course number, it's Hort 344. Last semester, I took the Hort 100 Introduction, which was very helpful, but I did know I'd say about half of it, whereas this class has gone deeper into individual plants and planting and why things happen. So I feel like I've learned so much from this class, and I thought it would be fun to share here. I do share some of the things I learn on stories on Instagram, but then I kind of compile everything that I've learned in each module here. So the structure of the class is that it's 4 different modules, and I've done a video for module 1, I've done a video for module 2, and this one is actually going to combine modules 3 and 4, which might have been a mistake now that I'm looking back, because so for module 1 and 2, we had design projects, smaller ones, and then we have a larger one, which is our final design project that's kind of gone over between 3 and 4. So both during modules 3 and 4, I've been working on one design. Also, the readings for module 3 was a much shorter section, so I didn't feel like there was enough for a whole video, although I probably could have made like a 10-minute video for that one. And now, module 4 was a lot more information. So this video might be a little bit long. I will try not to ramble too much, although I can't promise anything. So module 1 was kind of like an introduction. Module 2 was designing for pollinators. Module 3 was designing for human aesthetics. And then module 4, it's kind of been a mishmash of like how to take care of plants, how to plant, just more in depth, I think, of everything that we've learned. So also in each module, we focused on perennials for each season. So because we started in the fall, this class, the first module focused on fall blooming perennials, then we did summer. Module 3 was spring, and module 4 is early spring. So I will go over the plants that we learned in modules 3 and 4. Again, these are going to be perennials that bloom during the time in Illinois. So zones about like 5 to 6, probably 7. I am still zone 6A despite the zone update, but it's really funny because 2 streets that way is now zone 6B. So I could go over there and start a garden in a different zone. But anyway, like I said, trying not to ramble. So I think I'm gonna go through what I learned first, and then I will go over the plants that we learned, and I'll put timestamps down below so that if you want to skip to the plants, you can bounce back and forth. Also, I list the plants down below in the description as well. So let's go ahead and I'll start with module 3, which was again designing for human aesthetics. Now, I think the main takeaway for me from this lesson is that when we are designing, especially designing a garden that other people can see or is in your yard, you have to, as much as you want to just garden for the pollinators, you also do have to take into account human aesthetics as well, because not only will you be looking at it, but also, you know, people passing by on the street will be looking at it. Something that's been, I think, kind of fought back and forth, at least here in Chicago, is having a lot of natives in your front yard because people were getting ticketed for growing weeds or not maintaining their weeds, even though they weren't weeds, they were perennials. I'll link down the article if I can find it, but I think it was just a couple of years ago that one of the families who got ticketed was suing to allow to have perennials in your garden without it being ticketed for weeds. And I believe that they won. So that is exciting, but that is something that you have to think about, you know, especially if you're going to be planting in mass. And again, as much as I wish we could just do whatever we want for the pollinators, if there are going to be other people around, you still want it to look pretty, maintained, and for yourself, you know, you want it to look pretty too. Now, my definition of pretty might be very different from other people's definition of pretty because I like to just throw plants wherever, but it is something that we can't just focus on one versus the other. We can't just focus on aesthetics for humans, and we can't just focus on pollinators. We really want to try to tie all those together. And all the plants we learn about are great for pollinators, and they're all really beautiful. So that is helpful. So humans do have a natural preference for nature. I think Probably anyone knows that. I know that living in a city, I do get a very different feeling. It relaxes me even to just walk around our neighborhood where we do have trees and you can see gardens in people's yards. But also when we get outside of the city and go on a hike in the woods, it's something that I feel like I really crave. And I think, again, most people probably can relate to that feeling. But as more people are moving to urban areas, I don't know if I have a percentage here, but it's going to be increasing over time. We really want to think about how to incorporate more nature spaces within the city itself. And that's one of the reasons why I started this channel, is because I want people, especially in urban areas who don't have a yard, to realize that they can create their own garden. I don't know what the future will hold, but I would love to use my certification to maybe start either working or volunteering with some organization who is working on bringing more nature to the city. Again, that's not something I've really looked into yet, but it is something that I think I would really enjoy dedicating my time to at some point in the future. So it says that some of the things that we covered in the class, within our preference for nature, are key factors that influence our preference and must be at optimal levels, so not too much or too little. And on this list was coherence, so all parts have to fit together and have some sort of appearance of order. Again, not how I would really describe my deck garden, but in general. Complexity, richness of planting elements, more than just like one mowed lawn with a few trees. Complexity can still be high and attractive if there is a lot of coherence. Again, I think my gardens are great at having complexity, coherence, working on it. Legibility, so one can figure out how to navigate the space. Mystery, it's boring to see the entire space at once, so adding in some layers and some hidden spaces, and then gateways and partitions. And we kind of learn like different categories of like, here's things people like, here's what makes a good design for humans. So I'll go over all of that. A portion of our lectures focused on the attention restoration theory, which I'll link down an article about that below. I think I'd read something on it before, but it basically just means that, you know, humans, we're wired again for natural spaces, and being in nature restores our attention. Now, in this section, I also learned a new word, biophilia, which is the innate emotional affiliation of human beings to other living organisms. So, you know, innate just means that it's hereditary part of us. So we have that connection with plants, animals. We spent 99% of human history so far as hunter-gatherers, not in the environment that we live in now. So that's why it is still in us. And I do wonder how that'll change over time. So living in urban settings, where we are separate from nature, can give us information overload, which can then fatigue us because it takes a lot of our attention to focus on like specific tasks, specific information. Whereas when you're in nature, it relaxes your attention. Oh, here is the percentage. So urbanization or migration towards cities, 68% of the world's population is expected to live in urban areas by 2050. And we have so much technology. I mean, I can even notice this difference from my childhood. I mean, maybe I am older than I think, but I don't feel like my childhood was that long ago. I'm 37 now. So, you know, 30, 20 years ago, it was already so different with the amount of time I spent outside versus now when there is so much technology everywhere all the time. I mean, we had a television when I was little, but it was not mobile. It stayed in one place. And we didn't have anything else. Like no technology followed us around. I don't think we got like a family computer until maybe middle or high school. So a lot of my entertainment was happening outside, whereas now more and more children especially, well, and adults, are spending more time either inside or even when we're outside, we're on our phones. So we don't ever really escape to nature the same way that we used to with the increase in technology. So the attention restoration theory just basically says being in nature is mentally restorative. Again, directed attention has a finite capacity, and that's what we use for most tasks. When I first started working like kind of the 8 to 5 in an office, it was so fatiguing, but I shifted to working from home 2015, 2016, where although I had like a general schedule and meetings at a certain time, a lot of my schedule was then up to me. Like I could work when it made sense, and being able to break up working made me so much more productive than when I had to be like in one place at a computer for that amount of time. So I definitely think that being able to take little breaks from work when you're directing your attention is incredibly helpful. Involuntary attention is effortless and does not fatigue us with extended use. So things like watching nature, moving water, wildlife, that is that involuntary attention when we're not like directly focusing on something because, we have to. So natural settings will engage our involuntary attention, rest our directed attention, and then that fosters attention restoration. A huge thing I do if I'm feeling either like just stressed or overwhelmed, or even just like I need a mental break, I will walk for 20 minutes outside and I feel so much better. So if you can incorporate that, I definitely recommend it. Walking has become one of my favorite activities over the last few years. People say like, what's your hobby? What do you like to do other than gardening? I'm like, oh, I like to walk. So going on to that then, 4 characteristics of restorative environments. First is that there's soft fascination, so things like benches, natural elements, things that will attract birds and wildlife, so bird feeders, bird baths, something that's going to kind of give you something to like look at, but again, it's not a directed attention, it's just like sitting there and watching the birds coming towards the bird feeder. The second characteristic is a sense of being away, so that can be created with like a sense of enclosure. You're surrounded by trees, surrounded by plants, you can't really see as much of maybe like the urban setting. There are the Lurie Garden downtown Chicago, even though you still are surrounded by downtown, there's so many trees and so many plants that you really do feel like you have escaped to somewhere else and you're not just in downtown Chicago. Extent, so this means depth. There's again no signs of everyday life. Having small but richly planted space, again that sense of mystery. You're able to walk through the plantings and not just around it, which again isn't something I think much about on my deck, but if I had a larger garden, you wouldn't want to just walk around the outside of your garden. You want people to kind of walk through and explore the space. And then compatibility, so nothing that's working kind of against our natural desired actions or inclinations. So things that they were kind of talking about is like domestication, observation, so having some sort of seeding, fire building, having a fire pit, gathering, even just walking around and picking flowers, which is one of my favorite things to do. So those again were the 4 characteristics of a restorative environment. So then the next category of terms was more related to design and creating a design that again will appeal to humans. And there are 3 major domains of design principle. And I think if you take more like design specific classes, or that's really what you're focused on, they go over this much more in depth. But the 3 main domains are order, unity, and rhythm. And I think that's kind of the order that they said to build it in. So focus on order first. Once you have that established in your garden, then go to unity, and then you can go to rhythm. So order is the big picture or the overall framework of the design. So kind of if you think of a tree, it's like the trunk with the branches coming off of it. 3 different ways to achieve order. You can do it through symmetry to achieve balance that way. You can also achieve it through asymmetry. So not necessarily the same plants, like if you have an axis, symmetry would be same on either side. Asymmetry would mean there's more of like you're balancing on either side of the axis, but it's not necessarily with the exact same plants in the exact same position. Or mass collection, so grouping elements together. This was something that was talked about a lot, is not just planting, and again, this probably makes more sense in larger gardens, but in smaller gardens too, you can apply it, but not just planting like one plant. So if I have like my raised beds, not planting one zinnia here, one cosmos here, one straw flower here, but having at least 3 of the same plant grouped together. Not, again, a hard rule you have to follow, but in terms of creating that order, it makes the colors stand out more. If I have, one yellow tulip in our parkway, it's not going to stand out as much as if I have 10 yellow tulips in a bunch. So that's what mass collection is. And it is something I want to think more about in my back garden, where I do tend to have more of a design in mind, sort of, than the front garden, which is more of a free-for-all. Next is unity, and again, establish this after you've established order, and this creates an internal feeling of oneness, harmony, and continuity. So there's 4 approaches to creating unity. The first is dominance. So you have one main element that is the clear focus in your garden. So maybe, for example, like one giant tree. I don't really have that in my garden. right now because everything is smaller. You know, I'm gardening on a rooftop deck. So I don't know, maybe that's something I'll think about trying to incorporate. Repetition, so repeating an object throughout the design, not just having, again, one thing, one place, but again, not repeating it too much. Like not having a garden where all the plantings are like plant A, plant B, plant A, plant B, plant A, plant B. You want to find that happy medium between too much or too little repetition. Next is interconnection, so physically linking each part of the design. Examples are, you know, instead of just plopping plants down in your yard, you create the flower bed where the plants go. There's mulch there to kind of tie it all together. Having like shrubs planted around an area, you know, maybe even having like stones around a bed, something that's going to tie all of the plants together. And then the last one was, well, so I said already, unity of three. So groupings of three similar elements in a composition together. And I think that's typically, except for maybe larger plants, what you do see is like 3 heuchera and not just one random heuchera in a garden bed. And that was really everything from the reading from module 3. So that's why I thought it might have been too short to just cover on its own, although now I'm looking at it's 1846, although I will cut some of that out, so it should be shorter. So now I'm gonna go on to kind of the notes from module 4 and the interesting things that we learned there. So again, this lecture was kind of more focused on the specifics of the design, tying everything together, really making sure that the design we're creating, that I will show you kind of where I'm at right now, will look pleasing. So first was 5 aesthetic considerations when you're picking out plants. One is timing of the bloom. So you want to have something blooming every season. You don't want everything in your garden to only bloom from like August to October, because then you have no blooms earlier in the season. And this was probably the one on the list that I think of probably second that I think of the least. At least when I first started, I just got plants I liked and I didn't really know when they bloomed and I never really planned for it. But now I know that I want to have plants that are going to bloom earlier in my garden and later on in the season, just so there's always something that is on show in my space. Next is color of the bloom. Again, my front garden is all of the colors. My back deck garden, I did try to stick with a color scheme there, and I did notice a difference in how I felt in the garden. Size of the plant, spread and height. This took me a little bit because I would just plop something anywhere. But you do, especially in a container garden, want to think about the size and the spread of the plants. Now, I do always shave off a few inches just so I can fit what I want in the garden. But do know that might require a little bit more maintenance, like pruning, making sure that it's not going to lead to any diseases. So it can lead to a little bit more maintenance by pushing things closer together, but I pretty much have always been okay with doing that, and it's worked out well in my garden. But also if you're just planting one plant, making sure you're putting it in a pot that's large enough to support it. Texture of the foliage and leaf size, and then probably the one I actually think about the least is the fall winter appearance, because most of my plants I do pull. I left some more this year than I ever have before, again mostly for the insects, but my garden just kind of gets completely put away. It's not, I mean, I do look out these windows here, but it's not the same, I feel like, because it is such a separate space away from everything else. It's not like I'm looking out here to see a bunch of really pretty like hydrangea bushes in the winter, or although I do have evergreens in the winter. Like I have to move things and store them for the winter so they can't necessarily stay in their place. So that's probably what I think about the least. But if you do have a yard, winter structure is very important to think about. Then we talked more about the plant texture. And this is another thing that, again, I don't really think about very often, but I am now starting to think about it a little bit more. But there are 3 categories of plant texture. So there's fine, medium, and coarse. Some of the things that can influence how we perceive a plant's texture is the foliage size. So the larger leaves, more coarse. Like I would never describe this pothos as a fine plant. Smaller leaves are more fine, like a fern. And then shape, so again, like more rounded would be more coarse, like long and thin would be more fine. The surface area, the overall habit of the plant. Also, this was interesting, distance from your viewing point. So they showed a photo, I think it was of an evergreen, I forgot the type, where when you're far away, you're seeing the branches and it looks more coarse. When you're up close looking at the little needles, it looks more fine. So thinking about kind of where you're mostly going to be viewing the plants. And then any like twigs or stem, the size of those. And then with that, so depending on if you want to make your space feel smaller or larger, I have a smaller space, so I probably want to make it feel larger, but lighter colors and finer textured plants make a space feel larger, whereas darker colors or more coarse plants make a place look smaller. So you can keep that in mind if you're trying to either make your space look larger or smaller. Then, because we talked about the earliest flowering plants in this module, module 4, just some best practices for working with bulb flowers. I've gone over this when I've shown myself planting bulbs, but just as kind of a refresher on some of these. So most hardy bulbs are going to get planted in the fall. The roots will start to form, but it's not going to be so warm that they're going to start growing. So that's why you want to get them planted now so they have that root structure. Also why you don't want to plant them when it's too cold outside already. Usually people say as long as you can work the ground, because then the roots can still grow. But if it's frozen, not only will we have a very hard time getting the bulb in the ground, the roots aren't going to form and the bulb can rot. So planting here, it's been so warm, but I usually plant mine mid to late October or early November. Vernalization, that's just the term that means the plant needs a long period of cool temperatures to spark the biochemical process that causes them to flower. And it's from Latin. The word vernus means of the spring. So I'd heard of vernalization, but again, I had no idea that vernus meant of the spring. So it's things like that that I really enjoy learning in this class. Also, ephemeral was a term that we learned, which is describing, in this case, the bulb's foliage. Ephemeral just means that it's short-lived. So the foliage of the bulbs in the spring is short-lived. It's not like the leaves or the flowers stay throughout the entire season, unfortunately. I would love to have tulips all year. General planting guidelines, small bulbs. Now, what would you consider small? Probably like an inch or smaller. Plant 3 inches deep and apart. A lot of times though, the packet will say, so I'll always follow what the packet says. But again, in general, if you don't know or it doesn't say, small bulbs, 3 inches deep and apart, larger bulbs, 6 inches deep and apart. Larger would be like daffodils or tulips. Don't plant bulbs on the edge of a flower bed. I don't really follow this, but because the foliage, you want to wait for the foliage to die back. So if you plant it on the edge of a bed, you're gonna see that dying foliage. Where if you plant it like say a foot back, and then let's say you have a heuchera here in the front, your tulip is back here. Like as the heuchera grows and the foliage on the tulip dies, it should start to camouflage it. So that's something I might think about in the parkway, because I did add some bulbs down there and I don't know how close to the front I put them, but just keep that in mind, because with the foliage, what you want to do is you want to wait for it to go from green to yellow to then brown. And once it's brown, you can cut it back, because the leaves, it's still going through photosynthesis, it's still sending energy to the bulb. The longer you leave the foliage, the more energy you're leaving for the bulb to make it through the next year and come back strong. Now you do though want to remove the flower, because again, you don't want the bulb focusing too much on producing seeds. So once the flower starts to die back, remove the flower, leave the foliage. And also another point on this, which isn't something that applies to me, but might apply to you, is if you want bulbs to naturalize in your lawn, I think, do crocus naturalize? I mean, I have containers, so that's why it doesn't really apply to me. But you can't mow until the leaves have ripened. And by ripen, it means turn that yellow and then brown. So do keep that in mind. If you want to have a lawn that's naturalized with bulbs, don't mow before, or set your, at least your, I'm pretending like I know how lawnmowers work, even though I don't have a lawn, but like set your blade high enough so that it's not going to cut the leaves off of the bulbs. Then we got into more of the maintenance. So bed cleanup, pruning, and dividing. So spring versus fall bed cleanup. I think there are pros and cons of each, and just do whatever works best for you. Some species you want to clean up in the fall because they're more susceptible to disease or insect infestation, and the two that we went over were iris and peony plants, but everything else you can leave if you want to for insects to overwinter. However, with that, if you are overwintering beneficial insects, you might also be overwintering non-beneficial insects. So if you had an infestation of anything, I would definitely cut that plant back. Don't leave that up. But if you haven't, then I would leave it. And for me, what I've done is I'm kind of doing like half and half, or maybe I've pulled a little bit more. I grow mostly annuals, so that's why I remove most of my plants. However, I did leave up zinnia stalks in one of the grow bags, just in case anything's overwintering or wants to feed on the seeds. And I do have perennials in my center raised bed that I need to pop somewhere else because there are going to be annuals in there, but I just wanted something kind of there through winter for myself and for nature. Other things you might want to do are deadhead your plants if you don't want the seeds to spread, but if you want the seeds to spread, leave them. And then other reasons for deadheading throughout the season for some species, but depending on the type of plant, for some species it'll trigger additional flowering. So you want to continue to do that throughout the season. That is why I cut my zinnias all the time for bouquets. People think I'm so kind to be giving them my flowers, and I'm like, you don't understand, I have to do this in order to get more flowers, so please take this bouquet. I have a reel on my Instagram from the summer, obviously, but I cut every single flower in my raised bed, and within a week it was full again. So the more that you harvest from sunflowers, the more that you will get. Again, just some flowers, not all flowers. It's also, again, going to reduce the amount of energy that the plant is putting towards seed production, unless you want seeds. In that case, you don't want to deadhead your plant so that the seeds can develop. What else was there on deadheading? Oh, just another reason to deadhead, it tidies up the look of the plant. Now, for the ones that I make bouquets out of, I love plants that I can harvest, cut and come again flowers. But for plants that I don't plan to harvest, like for example petunias, I prefer ones that you don't have to deadhead, because I don't want to make extra work for myself when I know that there's plants that will continue to produce without you having to deadhead. So if I want to harvest them, cut and come again, love those flowers. If I'm not planning to harvest it, I want something that I don't have to deadhead because I will forget to do it. Next, we moved into dividing perennials, which isn't, again, a thing I necessarily have to do much of, or really any of, maybe in the parkway at some point, but the best time to divide your perennials is in spring when the growth emerges, but fall works too. Now you can, winter you don't want to, again, ground is frozen, but they said you can still divide in the summer, just you need to be more careful with the extreme temperatures, make sure you're watering more often. The plant might have a harder time bouncing back, so if you can do it in spring or the fall, that's better than doing it in the middle of summer. Some signs that a perennial needs to be divided. Flowering is either reduced or the flower is getting smaller. The growth in the center of the plant dies out, leaving a hole with growth around the edge, which I'm pretty sure is what happens to hostas. It hasn't happened to any of the hostas in our parkway, but I think they're only 2 years old. You know what? Probably the dahlias would be one of them that the flower size would reduce, because I did notice that with one of them this year. So maybe, it had a fungal disease anyway, so I tossed the tuber, but maybe I should have dug that up and looked at it more closely to see if it needed to be divided. Third sign to be divided, the plant loses vigor. Fourth, it starts to flop or open up, if that's not the natural habit of it. And then also the plant has outgrown its bounds or its spot in the garden. Now for me, I divide houseplants pretty regularly too. Not this one yet, but people always ask me, what are you going to do when your plant outgrows the box that it's in, which creates this kind of plant curtain is what I call it. I divide. If I know that I want a plant to stay in a pot, once it starts to lose vigor or becomes too root bound, I'll just cut some of it out and leave the rest in there. So that's going to be my plan with the pothos curtain. Then we talked about, still in maintenance, but sun exposure, soil types, moisture, and mulching. And this, I think in general, if you're gardening, you know, like full sun, part shade, full shade. But something I guess maybe I didn't know or didn't really think about was that sun exposure doesn't have to be continuous. So if you have a plant that needs full sun, but it gets like the first 4 hours in the morning, then it's covered by a tree like mid-afternoon, and then gets 4 hours later in the afternoon or evening, as long as it's still getting X amount of hours of sun throughout the day, doesn't have to be in a row, that still counts. Again, I don't have that situation because you're either getting east sun or you're getting west sun, but if you do have a yard and things are only covered for a few hours in the middle of the day, it still can technically be a full sun location if it's getting that 6 to 8 hours at some point within the 24-hour period of a day. Wind, I deal with this a lot in the garden. Wind will dry out soil and plant tissues much faster than if there was no wind, so you can try to find plants that are drought tolerant. It also can knock over plants, so provide protection and support. Yes, I do know that. Didn't do a great job at first providing protection, have gotten much better over the years gardening up here. Then we went into soil, which I still learned a lot from. Obviously I use all potting mix, but I do keep in mind like soil drainage, water retention, and all of that, and kind of adjust to what I need. But when you're working with soil, you'll either have like more sand, silt, or clay. A loam, which is what you want, is a mixture of all three elements. So again, that's kind of preferred. Now, sand is going to allow for the most drainage. Clay is going to have the least amount of drainage. So again, you want all three of those elements because the space between each of those elements is the space that allows for either the retention or exchange of air and water. They also talked a lot about getting your soil tested. So if I had a yard, I would definitely do that to figure out, I think we have a lot of clay soil in this area. Definitely compacted. If you do have any sort of like yard in the city, I think if I sent them some of my container soil to test, they'd be like, why did you just send us some potting soil? So I don't know if I'll ever do a soil test now, but if I ever have a yard, I definitely will. Moist, well-draining soil is the most commonly needed soil condition. I mean, I think that's what almost all of my plants say, moist, well-draining soil. Now, again, this class focused a lot on perennials. So most perennials cannot survive in poorly draining soil. Which again is the issue I have most in my garden. So I always make sure to amend to increase the drainage, but they also don't necessarily perform well in high fertilized soil. Now with my annuals, I do add in compost and I do add in a liquid fertilizer on maybe about a weekly basis, every 2 weeks sometimes. But with perennials, I don't know how, again, I have a container garden, so the nutrients run out faster. But I would definitely not have to fertilize, and I would probably try not to fertilize at all if I had more perennials in my garden, which again is something that I think like I kind of knew that they didn't need as much feeding and nutrients as a lot of annuals. Also, many perennials are drought tolerant, which again is great for your garden if you do have a container garden and it doesn't rain very often, finding drought tolerant plants. Like I've said, my soil, the issue I run into the most is that we do get a lot of moisture, especially in the early spring. So my containers retain moisture. So I need to add in perlite or I'll add in vermiculite in order to increase the drainage for my plants. So understanding drainage of plants, water retention, all of that has really been helpful instead of just like dumping in a bag of potting mix, because as the potting mix sits there over time, larger particles like perlite will start to break down. So the particles become smaller over time, which means that the soil in my containers, or the potting mix, I'm trying to say potting mix because soil technically is different. The potting mix then is made up more of those, again, smaller particles. So it's less well draining than it used to be. And then two things I thought were really interesting, obviously I found a lot interesting, is that soil that is too moist is often the cause of plant death over winter, more so than cold weather. And that's something when I've killed a plant that I've left outside over winter, I was trying to really figure out what it was. And my gut was telling me that some of my plants were staying too wet and the roots weren't getting enough oxygen, causing the roots to rot and the plant to die, versus it just being too cold. Now, I'm sure the cold has just taken out some of them as well. But I know that in my environment, because we do usually have such moist winters, I think, like for example, with my tulip and daffodil bulbs, I think that's been more of a problem, the too much moisture versus too cold of weather. And the other interesting fact for anyone that is building a home, it says, if you're building a home, ask the construction people to save topsoil. So when they're like, let's say they're digging up your basement, save the topsoil and spread it back out over the top of the clay soil. So if you're digging out the basement, there's going to be the layer of topsoil on top, and then the majority of what they're digging out is going to be clay soil. That's what they're going to spread onto your yard. So when you go to garden or grow plants, you're going to have heavy clay soil. So have them lay down the clay soil and then save the topsoil and put it back on top. I think she even mentioned, our professor, that like some construction companies will save the topsoil and like sell it. So ask them specifically to save your own topsoil and spread that back out over the top. Then we talked about watering, just general rule of thumb. Most plants want 1 inch of rainwater per week for herbaceous perennials. That'll obviously change based on some plants that you're growing, but that's a general rule of thumb. If you don't have a rain gauge, which I don't, but maybe I should get one, I kind of just have buckets up there that fill up. Also recommended is a tuna can, because that's about 1 inch tall. So if the tuna can is full every week, you don't have to water your perennials if it's full from the rain. And then most flowering perennials don't need much water after the first year once they're established. This, again, is probably very specific to our environment. If you live in a very dry environment and you're growing plants that want more water that aren't native, then you probably need to water them more. But we typically get enough rainfall here. Like growing up, we never watered our trees, for example, in our yard, unless they were newly planted. It's just not something that we had to think about. So if you do live in an environment where you get a lot of moisture, then you probably won't, once the plants are mature, have to water them. But again, if you're in a different environment, don't take that as a hard and fast rule. Then we talked about what technically makes a low maintenance plant, because I feel like you hear that all the time. I say all the time, like, oh, this plant's really low maintenance. These are the best low maintenance, even house plants. But what does that actually mean? So this definition was from a book, and this is where most of our reading was done for this last module. We read from PDFs that the professor had posted online. I think I'm actually going to get this book and invest in it and read the whole thing instead of just the chapters that were picked out for us. The book is called A Well-Tended Perennial Garden from De Sabato Aust, A-U-S-T. I did see it's on Amazon, so I have it like saved to my list of things to order at some point. But it just seemed like everything I read in there was like, oh, this is really helpful. This is really helpful. So I should probably get the entire book. So what this book says is that a perennial could be classified as low maintenance if it has 4/5 of the following. So 8 out of 10 from this list. A lifespan of 5 or more years, because obviously if you don't have to replace it as much lower maintenance. Cold hardiness. Heat, humidity, moisture tolerance. Doesn't require frequent division. Doesn't require daily deadheading, doesn't require staking, insect and disease resistant or tolerant, doesn't require numerous prunings to maintain the foliage or habit, doesn't require heavy fertilization, and not invasive. So if there's 8 out of 10 of those, that is technically, again, according to this book, what is a low maintenance plant. That is, again, everything that kind of stood out to me for modules 3 and 4. Sorry for this video being so long. Let's quickly go through the plants that we talked about. And again, they'll be listed below in the description, just in case there is anything that you might want to add to your garden. So for the spring perennials, and this is more like plants that'll bloom sometime between April and June, which really is a time when I need more flowers in my garden. Most of the annuals I grow start blooming like end of June. So Alchemilla mollis or lady's mantle, Allium giganteum, giant Allium, which I did plant some of those in pots, Amsonia hubrichtii, Arkansas blue star. I think I have this in my native bed, I'm pretty sure. Again, please forgive me if I'm pronouncing any of these incorrectly. Aquilegia hybrids, Columbine flowers. I don't know if I ever do what they look like. They're really pretty. So I think I would love to add some of those somewhere. Baptisia australis, this I do know that I have some of, or blue indigo or false indigo. Camassia scilloides, wild hyacinth. This is when I learned there were a lot of different hyacinth types. So that's Camassia scilloides, wild hyacinth, epimedium, rubrum, bishop's hat, geranium maculatum, spotted geranium, geranium sanguineum, hardy geranium, which looks really pretty. I want some of that in my garden. GM triflorum, prairie smoke, also looks really pretty. Hyacinthoides hispanica, this is wood hyacinth or Spanish bluebell. Iris, we kind of just talked about all of them in general. Muscari armeniacum, this is the Armenian grape hyacinth. So again, 3 different hyacinths on this list, which is why it's more helpful to go by the Latin name than the common name. Nepeta x fascinii, catmint, phlox subulata, creeping phlox, which I didn't realize how much that flowered in the spring. I also would love to add some creeping phlox to my garden. Salvia nemorosa, perennial blue salvia, tulips, just cover those in general, vinca minor, creeping myrtle, and Zizia aurea, golden Alexander. So those were, again, plants that would flower more from April to June. And then for module 4, we went through the plants that would flower, even some starting, well, I think there's only one starting in January, maybe January to March or April. So this one was a very short list. But on here we had Eranthis hyemalis, which is the winter aconite. That's the one that, depending on how warm winter was, could potentially start blooming in January. So this will bloom January to March. Then Galanthus nivalis, snowdrops, which again maybe could be January, but it's more like February through April. Crocus, chrysanthus, snow or golden crocus, February and March. Crocus vernus, common crocus, which I think that's more of what I have planted out in my raised beds, March through April. Scilla siberica, Siberian squill, March through April, and then Narcissus or daffodils, April through May. Then she also threw in, our professor, a few annuals. And this is just a reminder too that, like, yes, a lot of the native pollinators prefer native plants. That's what's going to work best for them, that they've evolved with. But also that annuals and things that aren't native, like just because I'm planting zinnias in my garden doesn't mean that I'm not doing anything for the pollinators. I had a bunch of flowers and bees and wasps visit them, so I am still providing something for them. I want to find that balance between more of the like native plants and my annuals that I love so much. So the annuals that were on our list were Anethum graveolens, which is dill. Never knew the Latin name for that before, the scientific name. Cosmos bipinnatus, cosmos. Helianthus, sunflower. Labularia maritima. Sweet alyssum, which I've grown that. Love the smell of sweet alyssum. And then Rudbeckia hirta, black-eyed Susan, for a biennial that was on the list. So those are all the plants that we talked about. Last, let me show you my drawing for the class. So this will be my final project drawing. Right now, not to brag, I do have an A+ in the class. However, we have not done our Module 4 exam. I have not had my drawing submitted or graded yet, and I haven't taken the final exam either. So we'll see how I end up at the end of that. So this is my drawing so far for our final project, for our final like design project. The first design project was taking a photo of a planting area. It was very small. I think mine was like 8 by 4 feet, and reduplicating it. So basically drawing what we saw with circles. Then the next one was creating a bed specifically for pollinators. So there wasn't as much thought to like the aesthetics of it. It was more just focused on getting the plants in there and doing a drawing. And then this one, we had to either design like a farm or a bed in someone's yard, so hypothetical obviously. So this is my flower bed with a bench there in the middle. I am doing it on graph paper, giant graph paper, as you can see, where each square represents a foot. So it's an inch in real life, but in the drawing, 1 inch here is 1 foot. And we did have to stick to a color scheme. My color scheme, which you can't really tell from this, is purple, yellow, and white, but you do have to color each of the plants a different color. So that's why it looks like it's much more colorful than it would actually be. So what we do is we have this drawing, and then you put the line leaders with different numbers, and that matches to the legend that we will submit with our project. She also had us include price. Again, this class is for undergrads. I'm taking it as part of the certification. So most people in the class are like between the ages of 18 to 22. So she wanted us to include cost just so we can see how expensive gardening can be. And I wanted to be like, trust me, I already know. I think my project with the bench is cemented into $1,000. I think my project is coming to $2,500 to $3,000. We also had to calculate mulch for this area as well. So yeah, each color is representing a different plant. If you have 3 or a mass of planting, you don't do completely separate circles, you kind of connect them together. So these 4 are all like one mass, they're not separate circles. If you are doing a separate plant, it's a whole separate circle here. And we also had to think about, because not all of these are going to be in bloom at the same time, like the foliage color, having not everything with the same color of green foliage. So I think this one is Salvia yangii, and it has like a silvery green foliage. So that one can work kind of on its own as a standout piece. But yeah, this is my drawing. Let me know if you have any other questions on it. I think most people in my, well, I don't know if most, but a lot of people in my class I know are using like an actual like software to design the garden. I don't have access to a software. I think a lot of them have it through the school if they're in the design classes, or that's what their major is. One, the free options I saw didn't do a great job. And 2, I didn't want to invest in the software because I'm not a professional garden designer. Plus, drawing this was kind of fun. If you've ever used an adult coloring book, it was kind of like the same thing. I popped on some Hallmark movies and it took about an hour and a half, or not an hour and a half, a movie and a half of Hallmark movies to color and label all of this. Oh, also something, oh, I think you can hear Penelope. The letters on the bottom represent the bulbs. So instead of drawing circles for each of the bulbs, which would be really small, you just put the letters, and like each letter represents, like for example, there's a C that actually represents plant 6 of the crocuses here. So that's how it's represented. And the bulbs are gonna grow into the perennials, and you wanna make sure you don't place them super close to the crown of the plant. All right, so that is everything. I do think I should have done Module 3 and Module 4 separately, but Module 3 would have been so short. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I think Penelope needs me probably to either pet her or feed her, one of those two. And let me know if you have any other questions about this class. Again, this is the last module for this class. I'll be done with it mid-December, taking a new class starting next semester. And yeah, so let me know if you have questions. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.